And let's see, meeting being recorded. Okay, continue. I won't click on leave meeting. Hopefully everybody can see my screen now. And I'll go into presenter mode. And hopefully you still can see my screen. Yeah? All right. And unfortunately, I'm in the web client, so I don't get like the big happy view of like everybody and looking at me. So that's fine. I trust you're all there. Oh, I should click on the attendees thing. Okay. Except the little I'm sharing. Oh, there we go. Participants. So who do we have today? Excellent. All right. Cool. Well, at least I can see your names now. So yes, I am Peter Chittum. I lead the Developer Evangelist team, both in EMEA and North America. There's my contact details. And first of all, thanks very much, Paul, for asking me to come and present on Lightning Message Service. Lightning Message Service is something that I've been working on off and on for about the last 4 or 5 months. It was in pilot for spring, it's been in beta, and now in the upcoming release, it's due to go GA, and no signs that that will change. So it's kind of fun. I've actually been working on the sample app implementation that we're going to have in the Lightning Web Components recipes app. And I should have added that link to the URL. Actually, I did sort of. I'm tracking all the work in a particular issue in that GitHub repo. So you can go and kind of see what the progress is and that sort of thing. And it's nearly done. We're going to have things go GA, in about 2 weeks now, I think, a little less than 2 weeks. And that's when all the stuff that I've been working on is going to go into the master branch. And simultaneously, the other developer evangelists are working on other places where previously we had implemented sort of cross-DOM messaging using the PubSub component that was made available as sort of an OSS component, really very much a shim for there not being anything like the Aura event functionality when Lightning Web Components launched. So, it was, PubSub was always meant as a sort of holdout or standby, that people could use while we were coming up with something that was a first-class feature of the platform. And I think Lightning Message Service will, I think people will really like this. And my slides aren't advancing. Yes, there is the ever-present forward-looking statement. And I might make some tonight, but of course, as usual, don't make any purchasing decisions based on those forward-looking statements. I was going to do a little section on the APIs. I think that's going to be part of the demo, but I will spend a little bit of time doing a bit of an intro to Lightning Message Service. And I've already kind of, I'm just beginning to talk about LMS publicly, so I'm already like changing my slides a little bit. I'm going to get to one called demo, and then there's a couple of slides I was thinking of doing after, but I think I'm going to talk about them before. There were some guiding principles around launching Lightning Message Service. The first was to have a client-side event bus that could talk between DOM branches. If you're familiar with programming on the web and dealing with DOM events go up and down a particular branch of the DOM tree. However, to be on one very deep node in one branch and communicate across to another deep node on another branch, that is not always straightforward. LWC, Aura, and Visualforce all needed to be treated as equal citizens, so none of them would be left behind, so to speak. And there was also this thing I'm putting up here is don't be surprising, and I'll talk about that in the context of, well, 2 things. One is actually called context, and the other one's called scope. So this is meant to illustrate, I actually wrote a blog post about this that's on the developer blog, and you might have seen this little diagram that I put together to try and illustrate this idea of communication between DOM branches. If you've ever dug into the actual DOM that is rendered when you open Salesforce and you first visit Lightning experience, it's complex. There's a lot of pieces to it. And as you can imagine, for having something that's going to be extensible, that is going to work possibly like a console app or possibly like a standard Lightning app, might have a utility bar. There's a lot of stuff going on in the user interface. And so in a complex user interface, sometimes you want a message to not necessarily have to bubble all the way up the DOM tree and then find its way back down some other branch of the tree. You just want to be able to publish between branches of those trees. And this is actually even more complex in the world of Visualforce, because Visualforce not only is in a different tree, but it's in a completely different frame and context and sandbox. And crossing the boundaries of the iframe that your Visualforce lives in Lightning Experience is not a trivial programming task. So cross communication between DOM branches. This I think illustrates that. That's the idea behind a publish. So Lightning Web Components, Aura, and Visualforce are all meant to be treated as equal citizens in this world of Lightning Message Service. Again, this is a really important thing. We have customers who have now investments in potentially all three of these sitting in the same user interface in the same org. Maybe we have customers that are hesitant to move forward into actually adopting Lightning Experience still because of their investment in Visualforce, and they maybe don't want to lose that. And they need that Visualforce feature to be interactive with the user interface. Likewise, if you have investments in Aura, you don't want to lose those, especially because they're going to keep on working just fine in Lightning Experience. And we also want to encourage development teams and architects to start planning their new features with Lightning Web Components. And obviously, if they're kind of sitting off in this ghetto where they can't talk to these existing investments that you have, then that becomes an obstacle to our developers being able to adopt the latest, greatest technologies that we've been working on. So yes, Lightning Message Service works for all three of these, works equally well, and works even across the protected boundary of the iframe that your Visualforce page sits in. And this is actually a screenshot of the implementation in the LWC sample app. I'll actually go into that live in a moment here. And I'm going to come back to the demo in a second. Okay, and then I kind of had this, don't be surprising idea in here. There's a couple of concepts that were not in the beta that are being launched with the GA version of Lightning Message Service. And they were kind of there as part of the API, more as placeholders in beta. But as of going GA, they actually play an important role in how you choose to architect the way that specifically a subscriber in Lightning Message Service makes itself available to the message service. There's this concept of context that exists in the world of Lightning Message Service, and this is still kind of a work in progress, this slide. The most simple way that I can help everyone understand context is in the context of something like the user interface and this example of a console app. And in the way that Lightning Message Service works, the contexts are actually the different tabs that are part of the console. So these different console tabs here that you see here are each their own context in the world of Lightning Message Service. And there can be other contexts. So for example, the utility bar could be one. And what happens is that when your subscriber subscribes to the message service, it's going to make itself aware of its context. So it needs to be aware of where it sits in this complex DOM tree. And the reason for that is that you have two options for making this subscriber join. And those options are defined by a subscriber's scope. So when I go and join when I call LMS subscribe, by default, I'm joining using the active scope. So I don't have to actually specify this. If I just call subscribe and I identify my context and I identify my handler, I will get an actively scoped subscriber. And importantly, basically everything in the UI is active scoped, except for these three things right here. Oh, I'm going to use my little virtual laser pointer. Oh, how exciting is that? So if you choose for your subscriber to be actively scoped, any of these things over here will always be listening for messages. Okay. Now, what if I choose? I'm sorry, I have that backwards. Yeah, strike that. Let's reverse that. Any of these things over here will always be listening if I choose to subscribe as application scope. Okay. So what that means is, kind of going back to the screenshot here, if I have an application scope subscriber on this tab here, it will be active. Sorry, it will be continuing to listen for messages, even though this particular tab is not currently in a selected state. So, this could be very handy if there is something, like one example that I've heard shared about is like a shopping cart that doesn't really fit in a CRM application. But, certainly if there's something that you want to, or that needs to be live updated behind one of these tabs here, even if it's not active, you can make that happen by using application scope. Right. Now, on the other hand, if I use the default scope of active, tabs that are not selected, any subscribers on those will basically power down while that tab isn't active. So an inactive tab with or an unselected tab with an active subscriber on it, that subscriber goes to sleep until the user goes back and selects that tab again, and then that subscriber will wake up again and begin responding to LMS messages. And so you can see here like the list of all the different things that are actually active, right? One thing that is interesting here is utility bar items are always active. So whether it's in the background or whether it's in the foreground, we will always update LMS subscribers on utility bar items. And there's a few other things in there as well. So even though I started off saying that completely backwards, hopefully everyone kind of gets the idea there. So application scope means that no matter where that thing sits in the DOM, I need to make sure it's going to be updated, whether it's in an active tab or not. On the other hand, if I want that subscriber to power up and power down as things like console tabs become active and not, then I can use an active or default mode. And I'm not going to get surprising behavior, for instance, where, maybe I've got something that's published and it's really only meant to go to the active tab, but it accidentally refreshes some other tab and I come and I see something I'm not expecting on there. That was actually one of the things that could happen in the context of the traditional Lightning application events, because they were always listening no matter where they were. Okay, so that introduces a few of the concepts. I think now probably time for a demo. And I'm going to go through, I've actually not fired up my Scratch org, so let me quickly go and find the right. Let me see, recipes. And we will fire up the Scratch org. Someday.
When you want it to go quick, it never does. Oh,
there we go. funny thing, like it never takes that long to fire up the Scratch org, but of course, when I'm giving the demo, um, it could also be that Chrome is very busy with the Zoom meeting. That could also be a factor. Okay. Let's go to our LWC recipes app. So this is the Lightning Web Components recipes app. I'll just spend 2 minutes and do a little orientation to the recipes app. The concept behind recipes is to have very simple, straightforward sort of solutions to atomic principles and ideas. And the guiding principle is sort of the minimum number of lines of code to get across how that particular feature would work. And we start from all the really basic stuff like hello world type of situations, to doing things like how does data service work to go and fetch data from the application. So if you've not seen this, I highly recommend going and taking a look at that. The recipes app and all of the sample apps that we build are actively worked on and updated every single release. We even force ourselves to do things that I wouldn't recommend in production environments. We actually upgrade the API version of every single artifact that is versionable every single release just to see if it'll break or not. So that's one practice that we follow. And the nice thing is that each of these recipes here has a link that will allow you to jump in and see the code that's behind that recipe. Now, the ones that I'm working on right now are not going to work because they haven't been moved into the master branch right now. But like I said, I will give you a link to the issue in GitHub that I'm using to track all the work that I'm doing on this. So the message service tab is the tab that contains all of the LMS features that I've been creating. There is a weird issue going on with our S3 instance that serves all of these images. I don't know what's going on with that, but it's nothing to do with either LMS or the Lightning Web components or components that I'm working on here. So just ignore that for now. It could be sort of a pre-release, some kind of pre-release weirdness going on, since this is a pre-release of API version 49, summer 20 org actually. The pattern that I wanted to show was to have a fairly simple implementation again because it's recipes, and the goal was to show a publisher in LWC, Aura, and Visualforce. I wanted those publishers to be as alike as possible in the way that they presented themselves to the UI, but obviously, the idiom for doing, a publisher in Lightning Web Components is going to be very different from that from Aura versus Visualforce. So, I went to some trouble to ensure that all of these things resembled each other in the UI. But of course, you'll see here how the implementation is slightly different. And then clicking on any one of these fires the same message channel. And the message channel is the thing that is like the event in the Aura world. And so it's pretty straightforward. I click any one of these and all of them update it. I created 2 Visualforce subscribers so that and these are a little bit beyond the sort of atomic definition of what we normally consider to be a recipe. Mostly because we wanted to show sort of let's say the minimal amount to get them to interact with Salesforce data. Because in the end, sending a message from using LMS from one widget on your page to another is actually really trivial. The API is very straightforward. I think what's more interesting and what was more useful to developers was to see, well, once you have that, like how do you then connect that to some Salesforce data? So on the Visualforce side, I actually have one that's using a remote object implementation and another one that's using an action function with a postback. So, the postback being kind of the old traditional partial page refresh Visualforce implementation that we used to build back when I started Salesforce 10 years ago. And remote object is a more recent feature that allowed sort of a more direct access. It was a much more lightweight wrapper around XML HTTP request, so that as a developer I could choose how to draw the DOM, and then that actually led to an explosion in Visualforce pages that were using third-party rendering libraries like Angular and React and that sort of thing. So, normally if you're building this sort of visual, React on Visualforce or Angular on Visualforce stack, you're using remote object, or remote apex is the other option. On the other hand, if you have sort of like older Visualforce pages, you're probably using postback. And I wanted to show both of those examples, so I implemented 2 different subscribers for that. All right, so that's kind of the overview of how those work. There's not a whole lot to see on the UI. I'm just going to sort of walk through the different code artifacts that comprise these at a high level. I'm not going to go through everything in detail, but try and pick out the relevant pieces that relate to the LMS implementation themselves. All right. So the starting point is actually the message channel itself. And I'm going to make that a little bigger. Maybe one more. And if I close my sidebar and I close that, then that'll make that a little bit easier to see. So first off, message channel is actually named for the file name itself. So record_selected. One of the choices that was made by the team that built LMS was to actually append an __C suffix on the message channel. I'm going to guess that's going to be a little confusing for the first 5 minutes of you using LMS, and then you'll probably get over it. At least that was my experience. The fact that an LMS message channel shares the same suffix as a custom object, basically. Now, apart from the message channel name itself, all of the rest of this, the fields that I add to this are advisory only. And what that means is that, in the end, the message channel, has a payload. That payload has some fields in it. Those fields, you can use the fields that are here, but it's also just a plain old JavaScript object. So if you wanted to, you could just willy-nilly add in a field. Obviously, you would need to be expecting that on your subscriber for that to do anything. One question that I sort of toyed with as I was trying to get to know LMS is, what are the possible things I can pass through this payload? Because of having to pass this payload across the boundary of an iframe, everything that is passed into any field on that payload has to be deserialized and then serialized again on the other side. So one of the things that you will not be able to pass without significant effort is functions. So like you can't just pass a callback function, or pass the function that you want to be invoked on the other side. Like that's not an option actually with this payload. All right, so that's message channel.
Depending on what is there.
Was that a question?
Is there a performance hit depending on what you're sending over it compared to the old pub sub? What's the performance like?
That's a good question. I have not tried to hit this with any kind of sizable payload with the scope of what I was doing for the recipe. So that would be an interesting topic to follow up on though, and to possibly do some testing out with that.
Yeah, I was thinking maybe OpenCTI, call disposition, push out something to some component that's on the page that's listening, for that call disposition, something like that. There might be some call data in there or something that's been transcribed on the fly.
Okay. Yeah, that's definitely an interesting problem to pursue. I'm starting to look at other avenues to explore as far as like other things to look at with Lightning Message Service, and maybe not doing the actual OpenCTI implementation, but seeing if we could get like something that's a reasonable payload for that and kind of mocking it from like a utility bar to a component. That'd be an interesting thing to sort of test out how that worked. Cool. All right. So, oops, that's not what I wanted to happen. Come back here. Okay. So starting with the Lightning Web components, there isn't really a lot there's actually really nothing in the markup for you to be aware of, except that, here this one has an iterator basically based on the contact data that gets returned. Now, this particular thing is the publisher, right? So one part of this is just going and fetching some contacts so we can have those. But the more important piece is that for each of those contacts, we have this handle contact selected event, right? So that's, where are we? There we go, handle contact selected. So that's our event handler for that particular region of the UI. And then when we get that, we're going to go and grab the contact ID and basically assign that to the record ID of the payload, right? If you recall, when I was showing the message channel, record ID was the field that I assigned there. That's all that corresponds to. But I could go and add additional bits and pieces in there. And then we simply call publish on that. Now, let's back up a little bit and talk about the different pieces that are involved in standing up the message service so that it works. Some of this stuff is just some boilerplate LWC stuff. We have an actual Apex method that's getting our contact list. The imports that we have are, first of all, from the message service, we have the publish function, and then we have the message context. And so the context in this instance is still required as part of the publisher. However, it becomes more critical when we get to take a look at the subscriber itself. So we publish our message context. We have our there we go. We have record selected as the message channel that we're publishing to, and then we have the payload itself, which we just created there. So those are your imports: the message channel, the publish, and the message context. And then we basically fire all that off with the publish by invoking publish. One thing about message context, this is actually implemented as a wire adapter. And the nice thing about that is that there is an API that you can invoke to explicitly get a context. In the case of subscribers, which we'll take a look at next, when you go and get the message context with the wire adapter, it basically tears down all of the LMS bits of this component automatically when this component is destroyed. So you don't have to explicitly handle the creation or destruction, or rather, you don't have to explicitly handle the destruction of your LMS features in the lifecycle events of your component. Which probably, let's just jump in and take a look at the subscriber. Again, from the context of markup, there's really nothing too exciting here. There aren't even any event handlers because all that's going to be handled in the context of the actual JavaScript itself. So this is a bit more involved, partly because the way that we're using the UI record API, using static field names and S-object names. But again, the important things that we have here are the message service being imported. And then we also have the record selected message channel again. Now, actually, I'm looking at this and I'm realizing I have some things I can clean up here, and I think I need to clean up, in fact. Yeah, so I'll talk about this in a second here. Oh, you know what? This is actually an older branch. That's why. Yeah, so that's fine. So I have my subscribe and unsubscribe. I have this application scope and I have this message context. So again, we have getting our record, right? Let's come down to, there we go. And obviously the wire adapter here, if you're familiar with Lightning Web Components, we're doing a dynamic or a reactive binding to the record ID right there. So that's kind of where we have this important bit here, where when we subscribe to message channel, right, we're going to check to see if the subscription exists. And if not, we'll go ahead and call subscribe. Now, message context, remember, that's that wire adapter. So what this means is actually this bit of code here is redundant as of summer 20. So that's going to be going away when I merge in the changes that I've been making to this particular component. Again, record selected right there. That is our message channel. We have our handler. And then finally, we have this scope here. Now, again, you can see here that this is set as application scope. The best practice that we are pushing forward for summer 20 is to always use default scope unless you actually need application scope. So when this gets rolled out and actually merged into the main branch of that repo, that's going to be gone because we want to be showing people the sort of best case or the usual scenario or the default scenario. One bit of work that I'm looking at sort of, I want to try and build out a good test case that demonstrates really clearly the use of application scope versus active scope in a couple of different ways and instances. So, hopefully sometime in the next few months, we'll have some content out that really illustrates that well. All right, so now the way that we're doing the subscribe is actually on connected callback. Obviously it's possible to do this as an explicit call, so that's definitely an option. And like I said, with this particular branch here, we have the unsubscribe that's taking place, but that is actually no longer necessary because of the wire adapter and the message context. So I can actually have this unsubscribe go away completely, and this will work just fine. When the component is destroyed, there won't be a sort of orphan subscription sitting out there in the message service. And there we go. So the actual handle message itself is pretty trivial. All it does is it takes the record ID that we got from the message, it sets it into the record ID property of this component, and we're off and running. So, and then it hits that reactive property. So as you can see, it fits very well in the idiom of Lightning Web Components. And I think one of the things that I'm really, I have to take my hat off to the team that implemented this is that like, using LMS in each of these different instances feels pretty sort of natural and normal. Like I don't feel like I'm, you know, trying to use something that was shoehorned into Visualforce but was written for LWC. All right, so let's go through the Aura implementations. All right. Now, the fun thing about Aura is there's so much more functionality in the markup. And in fact, for the message channel publisher, this is all you have. So you basically have message channel, you have the channel itself, and then you have this Aura ID. And the Aura ID is what we're going to use to, here we go. When a contact is selected, so again, we have that list of contacts in the UI. We're going to go and grab its ID, set it into payload. We'll go and find our message channel and call publish off of that. So, I find this actually to be really succinct and really straightforward. Not a whole lot here to go through and explain. And similar to the way the wire adapter works, the Aura framework takes care of tearing down anything related to LMS when the component's destroyed. All right, moving on to the subscriber. And there's our message channel there. Again, the application scope has been removed as of now and will be removed from this particular implementation when we go live. So again, we have a message channel, and then we have a message handler here, and that's it. And so this is one of the peculiarities of LMS in Aura is they didn't implement subscribe or unsubscribe. When you pop a message channel onto your Aura component, it will be subscribed as soon as that component comes online. I'm already starting to see people asking about this, and I have a few thoughts in the back of my mind, like if I were to go and get a handle to that message channel, would I find a sort of available but undocumented function called subscribe or unsubscribe? Like I've been kind of like toying with playing around with some things like that. But as of now, the functionality is that your Aura component is always subscribed. And in this instance, yeah, so handle message, again, it's going to go and set a record ID. It's going to set the contact ID. It's going to reload the Lightning Data Service to then go and load the record into the user interface that's been selected. So all the rest, that's pretty straightforward. And that wraps up the Aura implementation. I have to say that working on this project, one of the things that in some ways was most fun, weirdly, was going back and writing some Visualforce. I was a huge Visualforce fan when I first joined Salesforce, granted 10 years ago. So it was kind of fun and a bit nostalgic to go back in there. At the same time, it also filled me with a lot of appreciation for Lightning Web Components these days. I fiddled around a lot with the different ways of implementing a Visualforce page with LMS. And some of the choices I made, I would say, might not be best practices for how you would architect a more complex a set of Visualforce resources. However, from the standpoint of making this a recipe that was easy for a developer to crack open the code, look at, and understand the intent behind the code, I feel like I finally got to a good compromise. And essentially what I have is, so the publisher itself is using a contact remote object. And this UL right here is what I'm using to populate the lists. But of course, all the functionality is in this LMS Publisher Visualforce static resource over here. So essentially, I sort of followed a design pattern that mirrored what you get in Aura and in Lightning Web Components, where I kind of have a dedicated JavaScript resource for this Visualforce page. And I did that for each of the Visualforce pages. But the nice thing about that is it makes the footprint of the JavaScript pretty straightforward. And I think I found it a lot easier to follow when I was sharing it with people. I used to have one big monolithic JavaScript static resource, and it was just for a way to learn how the API works, it was not ideal, let's just say. Okay, so the other choice that I made was to implement this using the ES6 module feature. And part of the reason for that is that, when it comes to something like a Visualforce page using remote object, I'm responsible for rendering that DOM. And I didn't want my JavaScript static resource to be filled with a bunch of HTML templates. So I externalized those HTML templates into their own static resource. And I want to do that using modules. So the downside of this is probably this stuff isn't going to work in IE11. And for anybody who really wants to look at this in IE11, I'll just apologize now. It was a choice I made. You saw my email address at the beginning of the presentation. I'm happy to take any comments or questions there. So,
how dare you?
What's that?
I said, how dare you forget IE11?
How dare I?
About it.
Yeah. Well, so the other option would have been to just like start up like a whole new Webpack project and then actually transpile to ES5. But I don't think that really fits a really good pattern for recipes either. So, you just have to make the choice you make, right? So now a couple of peculiarities that we have to deal with when dealing with LMS in Visualforce. First off, the message channel itself is bound via a global variable called message channel. So that's one thing, and so I'm passing that in using this set page configs function that I've exposed from this module here. I'm going to be interacting with my contact remote object, so I'm passing that in as well. And then the other peculiarity is that the publish and subscribe are hanging off the good old standby sforce.1 APIs. So I'm just passing, so for each of these where I'm using publish and subscribe, I'm passing in the function that I'm going to use in that particular static resource. All right, so looking at the publisher JavaScript, a few important bits and bobs here. The important LMS related functionality is kind of right at the top here, where handle contact selected is the event handler that I eventually assign to each of the list items that I render into the DOM. And again, those list items are sitting over in this other JavaScript module called templates.js. So I'm not going to open that up. If you want to take a look at the code, like I said, it's available on the GitHub repo. I'm also using an ID in a data set so that I can actually pass in the correct contact ID. And then I'm going to assign that to that record ID that's part of the payload. And then I call lms.publish. And you can see here that in this instance, I have cleaned up and I am not doing an application scoped. I'm sorry, that's subscriptions. So we'll see if I have that on the other side. I think I do in this case. So, all right, so there's my publish to my message channel. And again, remember, message channel was just over here passed in via this set of configs. Okay. All right. So next up is the, I'll do the subscriber with Visual Force remoting first. Again, I have a remote object. And again, I'll pass that remote object into the JavaScript module along with the message channel. And in this instance, the subscribe function off of sforce.1. Let's just make sure that's the right one. Yes, Visual Force remoting. Okay. Okay, so first off, when my page load is complete, I'm actually going to invoke this wrapper for subscribe. So, and this is one thing, you know, I'd love some feedback. This code isn't necessarily exactly how it's going to go out the door. You know, this is a little bit of a relic from kind of the earlier implementation that I did of this. I sort of liked putting the subscribe in its own separate function to make it sort of easier to call attention to in the comments, as opposed to having it be like an event listener, you know, an anonymous function event listener that's kind of sitting off of this ready state change event. So I'd love to hear feedback from all of you on this call, you know, whether you feel like that adds any value. And if not, I might just change this and just put the subscribe call directly into this anonymous function down here. In any case, the important thing is handle LMS remoting is my handler. And so I get the message from that. I pull out the record ID. I then can invoke my remote contact where I've passed the record ID to it there. So, and that gets my actual contact. All right. Last bit is the postback action. Now, of course, this being more classic Visual Force, this is a much more, you know, the markup on here is a lot more involved because I've actually gone to the trouble of basically going into SLDS and finding a few components to come up with the structure of what this is going to look like. And then it all is displayed or not based on whether or not I have a contact ID using the rendered tag up here. Is anyone feeling nostalgic yet for good old classic Visual Force? I have an action function here that's wrapping an Apex method called refresh contact. And so I get a handle to that as refresh contacts function. For those of you who've never written Visual Force, you can just sort of like, you know, you can either be like really fascinated or you can maybe just go to sleep for 2 minutes while I walk through this. Important thing here is that I have to, I do have to set an ID parameter value because eventually I'm going to get that from, I'm going to have to use a little bit of Apex to go and retrieve that in my Apex class. That's essentially how I pass that ID up to my Apex. All right, so the important bit, of course, now is my static resource. I go and get that. Again, I pass the channel, I pass subscribe. And in this instance, I'm going to pass the action function because when I receive the message, I'm going to want to invoke that refresh contacts function. So let's go take a look at that. All right. So here, again, subscribe to message channel does the same thing, calls LMS subscribe, but in this instance, I'm handling it with handle LMS message postback. And in true classic Visual Force fashion, it is super straightforward. I just simply call action function, I pass in the record ID, and we're off and running with that. So, you know, so that kind of does a little walkthrough of the different bits and features. Oh, and One thing that I can draw attention to here is that I actually did use the best practice of not setting this as application scope. So this one is actually set to active scope. And if this were like on a console tab, for instance, if that tab went to be unselected, this message channel or this this particular subscription would go quiet. It would no longer listen at that point. All right. And that's kind of the code walkthrough. That's that's what I built for the LMS recipes. Like I said, there are a number of LWC recipes. There's a number of other recipes that are going to be made available. There are a number of other implementations of LMS that are going to go live with Summer 20 in about 10 days or so, when we move all of the pre-release branches into GA. All right, let me go back to, I think I have one more slide maybe. Just with a couple of resources. So I did just write a blog post about this that went out about 2 weeks ago, I want to say. So if you want to read more about that, there's a bit more in there about context. I don't go and sort of walk through the code of every single one of those, but you'll see that there's a little bit of a, I'm using the same LWC recipes as examples in that particular blog post. In addition to that, as I said, the work that I'm doing ongoing to get this ready for GA is in a GitHub issue, and I put a little bit.ly link there if you want to take a look at that. That will also tell you which branch to go to if you want to take a look at the current state of the LMS implementation and actually play with it, run it yourself. The one caveat to that is that that entire branch, that pre-release branch, is running on API version 49. So you will need to make sure to have an org that is also on Summer 20 pre-release in order to get any of that functionality to work in it. And with that, I will stop sharing my slides and take any questions.
We have a bunch of questions in the chat for you, Peter. So
Ooh, okay, all right. I'll start to.
You want to read them out for you, or do you want to scroll?
No, I can start to pick through it. I'll start with the sort of earliest one.
The earliest is Jonathan's at 6:20. If you can see the time.
Okay. Does this make the Aura event function redundant if we cannot use LMS to communicate between Aura components? Sorry, if we can just use LMS to communicate between Aura components too, saving that task of bubbling an event, for example. Honestly, I feel like I should have given more thought to that. So as it stands right now, as I understand it, there's nothing preventing you from using LMS to replace or to use as an alternate to the original Aura event functionality. Did I say that safely enough? Like, I think if it were me, I would lean strongly toward using LMS, if for no other reason than the scope feature. Like I said, what you get with application scope in LMS is a lot closer to what you would get in an Aura event that is set to application level as well, which means that like anything that's listening to that behind a tab is going to be constantly reacting to that. So by switching to LMS, I think at the very least, you would be able to set those to active scoped. And then you might actually reduce the chatter going on, in your Aura application, your Aura user interface. So I'm not played around with that, but I think that would be a really positive side effect of that, and I can't think of any negative ones, so I'll keep it at that. Could you please give us some insights on governor limits on LMS? Can we use LMS in Lightning Out components? So for Lightning Out, no. There are some other restrictions as well. So the support for communities is not there. I think it does work in some instances, but they've opted for just saying it's not supported for the time being until they get that across the board. So for Lightning Out, communities, and there's one other that I'm forgetting. I meant to have a list of the don't use it there, but it is all in the documentation very clearly. So will it be able to communicate with components inside a flow when published outside? I believe so. And that would be a really good one to actually demonstrate or test. So yeah. I'm just looking to see if there's anything in the... So what I'll say is, I don't see why not, but I've not done it myself. Okay, there's pausing. Debugging. If my subscriber is not catching the event, the first thing I would check is if I mistyped the LMS name. Then I'll review the scope that you mentioned. What other debugging tips would you give me? I mean, honestly, I've done a lot of debugging when working through this stuff. Probably more in the visual force than in anything, especially the visual force where I was using remote. And honestly, there was never a case where I wasn't just able to use sort of standard debugging tools in my browser to solve the problem that I needed to solve. So, you know, I guess the best bit of advice I can give you is get good with browser debugging tools. You know, yeah, but apart from that, there wasn't anything that was surprising. If anything, it was just surprisingly easy and straightforward to get all of these APIs to work. Maybe I shouldn't say it's surprising that way. But yeah.
We'll edit that.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, you can take that one out in the edits. Could you give us the resources URL in chat? Yeah, I can grab those for you really quickly. Go. There's the blog post, and there is the Git issue. That looks like everything. Any other questions?
This is your last chance to post a question to Peter before Peter chooses the best question to get the certification voucher. So,
oh, I have to pick a best question. Oh, so let me ask this, because I did ask for some feedback on that. Maybe I'll share that on the screen again, because I am really interested. And honestly, like, the North Developer Group has been really helpful in the past in workshopping things with me. So I might as well keep that trend going, eh? All right. So let's go to yeah, this will do here. So, you know, and let me set some of the context first. And that is, you know, bearing in mind this is an app designed to show code in a way that developers will get what's going on as easily and as quickly as possible with as little work trying to process what is this bit of code doing. You know, so ready state change complete is the state for, your page has loaded and you can safely execute JavaScript, particularly in the context of some of these visual force objects that we have to use here. Now, clearly, I could have done this completely differently. And for example, I could have taken this LMS subscription here and just moved that right down into, I could have taken, here, should we just do a little live coding? I'm just going to undo it anyway, right? So I need to be a little less cavalier than that. So LMS channel subscription equals, and then I could do underscore page configs dot LMS subscribe, and from there, so this is really the crux of my question. There we go. Is that easier to get your head around? Missing my semicolon, notwithstanding. As far as what's happening, or is it more straightforward to have like subscribe to message channel in its own separate little service function? What do folks think? I don't think I can do a poll.
I can probably try and do one though. Oh.
So people can just post in the chat, like extra function or anonymous function in the event handler. What do folks think?
I don't know, people posting in the chat.
A couple people are saying separate function. Enzo thinks it's anonymous function is clear enough. Anonymous function, it's kind of split, isn't it? There's an extra function. Okay. All right. Well, I mean.
So I was going to ask a pointed question on that. Like, would you, if you were writing this for production code, would you write an extra function?
It's kind of a hard, so if I was writing this for production code, there are a lot of different choices I'd make here. So like that's sort of the, that's kind of the hard part about this is like, like one advantage to having the extra function in a production environment is actually like where I could put that is in a separate module. And then, maybe on one component, I have a button that allows me to subscribe, but on another component, I auto subscribe on page load, right? So like in that case, having the function as a wrapper makes perfect sense. And it was probably something I would most likely do in production, just to have that as like its own little thing, So I guess I just answered that question. In any decent sized implementation, I think you're going to want to subscribe to message channel wrapper that you can just easily chuck a handler in there, and incidentally, probably a Boolean third parameter that allows you to do it as application scoped in reality.
Okay, yeah, makes sense.
Yeah. I would write the extra function, but only to be explicit, less chance of people jumping in with extra stuff. Yeah, okay. I like that. All right. Well, I appreciate the feedback. I was kind of leaning toward keeping the extra function anyway, but, I guess what helped was to not, like, there wasn't, like, a unanimous vote for just do it in the anonymous function, Peter. So that's cool. That's really helpful. I appreciate that. Let me just... Cool. All right. Now, I get to pick the best question. Is that?
Yep. Choose the best question, and then if that person wants to send me their email address privately in the chat, I will furnish them with a voucher for a certification, which is good to the value of 400 of your United States dollars, I believe.
All right. Thinking about this. Oh, I didn't really answer about governor limits. So let me just mention that. So there are no governor limits that I've seen in any of the spec docs or documentation about this. And typically speaking, when dealing with purely client-side features like this, governor limits are really about putting a throttle on our multi-tenant resources. Once this code is out in your browser, which is the only place LMS ever runs, our multi-tenant resources are not really as important. And especially because the functionality of LMS only ever stays in the browser. Now, it could possibly trigger a server call, right? But we already have features in place to make that, only when necessary. So for example, if I'm using Lightning Data Service with LMS and it does a call to Lightning Data Service, if we already have the cached value, we're not going to make the server trip anyway. So yeah, I'm going to go out on a limb and say there aren't any governor limits, at least that I'm aware of, and I wouldn't expect there to be because of it being purely client side. So sorry I missed that. I missed answering that before.
I'm going to edit that exact snippet of you saying there are no governor limits and just say Peter said.
That's going to be, you're just going to make that like a GIF on Giphy, huh?
Yep.
There are no governor
limits. There are no governor limits, yeah. I am going to go with Ashwin because he stumped me on the flow question. Like I said, I'm pretty sure, but it's not something that I've tested or even asked about at this point. So so good on Ashwin for stumping Peter on LMS inside of a flow component.
Well done, Ashwin. Cool. Ashwin, drop me your email address, mate, and I'll send you a certification voucher. And so any more questions or anything we'd like to hear from Peter? Because we are a little bit over, so I appreciate everyone. We're a touch over. But if not, well, once again, thank you very much to Peter for coming and sharing a fantastic session with us. The recording will be uploaded to the YouTube channel soon. And I believe the next group is going to be a big shared Trailhead DX global gathering with the rest of the Northern groups. So the Leeds admin group, the Manchester admin user group, I think there's a few others that have signed up as well. So there'll be a big announcement about that soon. So yeah, thanks everyone for turning up. Congratulations to Pearl as well for winning the Furthest Distance Award, joining us from San Francisco, which is pretty amazing. So yeah, it's we've gone global, not just Leeds anymore. So yeah, thanks everyone, and take care, and speak to you all soon.